Authorities say a Virginia police officer lured a 15-year-old in a catfishing scheme and then proceeded to murder her mother and grandparents. Former CIA case officer and criminal defense attorney Jack Rice comes on to try to make sense of this horrible case. We want to focus right now on a truly chilling and horrifying story out of Riverside, California. Authorities say a Virginia police officer, 28-year-old Austin Lee Edwards, met a 15-year-old girl online through a catfishing scheme, allegedly pretending to be a 17-year-old, drove from Virginia to her home in California, and then proceeded to kill her mother and grandparents, set the house on fire, and then he drove off with the girl. Now, the 15-year-old has been recovered. There's reports that she's being evaluated for intense trauma counseling. And we believe that Edwards killed himself after a shootout with sheriff's deputies. I want to bring in right now Jack Rice, former CIA case officer, criminal defense attorney, a frequent contributor on the Law&Crime Network. Jack, it's great to have you.
Great to be on the program.
I'm sorry that this is the case that we're tackling, but I think it's a really important one for people to understand. And I think the family is trying to make it clear to the public the dangers of catfishing, the dangers of an online presence. We'll get to that in a second. I want to talk about the investigation because even though the suspect is deceased, the investigation's still going to continue, right? I understand they want to do an extensive digital investigation. What do you think is going to be happening behind the scenes?
Well, I think it's really important in a case like this. I mean, a lot of times for people who aren't following this or do this on a daily basis, when a suspect dies, frequently everything gets dropped. They just move on, and I think that has to do with sometimes just the numbers of it, the realities and the logistics of investigations. There's only so many cops, only so many detectives, only so many special agents. But in a case like this, it's different. And the reason it's different is because the nature of how the internet works and the platforms that were being used, the potential for other victims that are out there, and the possibility that there were others who were involved as well. And so when you start thinking about the nature of how, dare I say it, the world works now, there is a potential for having a footprint that walks backward that could lead to a lot of other things, and that's important.
Because they think that he might have done this before. Maybe not killed family members of people teenagers he was stalking, but if they can show that there were other victims of his, that's what I think they're primarily going to do, right?
Oh, no question about it. But I think it really does highlight the sensitivity of this and the benefit, dare I use that term, the benefit of being able to use the internet in an offensive way for the government to reach backward, to essentially deconstruct and see where this started and where he may have jumped previously. If there are other victims that are out there, the ability to reach out to them and potentially provide them support, to try to provide them help, is something that I think is always important, because it's a sad thing sometimes when the government is there at the end of the day, when everything is broken, and they can't actually proactively come in and say, let's do something good before, or at least while this is going on, to maybe improve circumstances for other people who have been involved.
I think one of the most alarming aspects of this is that he was a police officer. So just to give you a little history here, he was hired by the Virginia State Police in July of 2021. He quit in October of this year. And then he was hired by Virginia's Washington County Sheriff's Office on November 16th, 2020. He had already started orientation. He was already in the middle of it when obviously this all happened. That aspect of him being law enforcement, how does that affect the case?
Well, it does. I think it's actually critically important for a lot of reasons. And one reason it is contemplate what the allegations are against this man. I understand that he's dead. But the thing is contemplate what it was that he did. Now, my next question is, what testing was done when he was going to be state patrol? What testing was done when he was going to be a sheriff? And all of these issues where you talk about the idea of what makes a police officer, or what makes a good police officer, or what makes a horrifying police officer. Because if we think about this, I think there was a perception for many years, and I've been practicing as a former prosecutor, a former federal officer, and as a criminal defense attorney since the early 90s. For a very long time, there was a perception that police officers were perfect, that police officers could do no wrong in some quarters of America and across the planet. There were certainly other people who would say, hold on, I have a long list of stories. This highlights the point that we're missing the boat. There is something wrong here when you actually do an investigation, or when you actually hire somebody and this person is capable of this. What did we miss? And that is a critical piece of this, because there are thousands of officers and that have been arrested over time. And you ask, why is it? Remember, I'm coming at this, and I'm in St. Paul, Minneapolis, St. Paul, where Derek Chauvin killed and murdered George Floyd. So I'm feeling it here.
I think you make a great point, because somebody's going to look at this and say, how on earth could he have slipped through the cracks? And also the big concern I would imagine is, did he use his training and resources to lure these girls? Now, it's speculation at this point. Was he ever involved in these kinds of cases? Knew the things to say, knew what apps or sites to use, because we're not exactly sure what app or site that he used at this point. It's still developing. And speaking of developing, the autopsy results of these three victims haven't been released yet, and we don't know what the cause of death is. Is that standard?
It depends. Obviously, I think in a case like this, it wasn't just a gun to the head. With these fires, there's a real question on whether or not what killed them. If this was asphyxiation, I understand some of the allegations included duct tape across the mouth. Thing is if somebody does this and it crosses both mouth and nose, you can asphyxiate that way too. And so I think what they're trying to do is to make that determination. But remember, like we were talking earlier about, this idea of seeing if he has done this before. If you have some of this information, you might actually want to keep it close, because you could then turn around and use it to see what else is out there and to see what else he may or may not have done. This just gives you a little bit more insurance, for lack of a better word, to make sure you can potentially make links. And you always want to be able to do that.
And just to reiterate, the three victims here are 69-year-old Mark Winnick, his wife, 65-year-old Sherry Winnick, and their daughter, 38-year-old Brooke Winnick. Now, I just want to leave us with one thing. This is a statement from Michelle Blandon, who is the sister and daughter of these three victims. And she wanted the public, again, as I mentioned at the top, to understand the danger. She said, quote, "Catfishing led to the deaths of the three most important people in my life, my dad, my mom, and my sister." She said this, and she continued to say, "To tell our story, to help your parenting, not out of fear, but out of an example of something that did happen." I think we should leave it at that point, and maybe we'll continue to follow this as we learn more details. Jack Rice, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
And thanks so much, everybody, for joining us here on Sidebar. Please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.